Into something really interesting. Today, we're not just looking at those grainy UFO videos. We're going deeper.
Mm-hmm.
We've got a fascinating source from a psyops expert who suggests there might be more to this whole UFO buzz than meets the eye.
What's really intriguing here is that we're not just asking if UFOs are real.
Right.
We're examining how this information is being presented and how it might be shaping public perception.
So less about little green men and more about the potential for, let's say, invisible puppeteers.
Exactly. And the timing of this sudden surge in UFO interest is what really caught this expert's attention.
Okay.
We went from decades of government denial to official hearings and terms like UAP being thrown around.
It's like someone flipped a switch, right?
Yeah.
And this expert doesn't think that's a coincidence. They actually lay out 3 potential reasons why governments might be pushing this narrative now.
The first one is classic misdirection. Think about it. When things are getting messy, a shaky economy, political scandals, whatever it might be, creating a distraction can be a powerful tool.
So like the magician's trick, look over there, not at what I'm doing with my other hand.
Right.
Except on a much grander scale.
Precisely. And they point out that the Pentagon released that UFO footage back in 2020, right in the thick of the pandemic.
Oh.
Makes you wonder, doesn't it?
Okay, so distraction is one possibility. But what if it's not just about diverting attention?
Mm-hmm.
Could there be a deeper, more unsettling motive at play?
That's where the second reason comes in. Think about the power of fear. It can be used to unify a population even against a fabricated threat.
Right.
Historically, this has been a potent tool for those seeking to consolidate power.
We've seen this throughout history.
Yeah.
The Cold War, the war on terror.
Exactly.
Fear can be a powerful motivator.
And they argue that UFOs could be the new boogeyman replacing those older threats.
All right.
If people are afraid, they're more likely to accept restrictions on their freedom, increased surveillance, all in the name of safety.
Hey, we're all in this together, so do as we say, kind of thing. Chilling stuff.
And then there's the third possibility, which is a bit more subtle. They call it testing the waters. Imagine you're a government trying to introduce a radical new idea.
Mm-hmm.
You wouldn't just spring it on the public right. You'd want to gauge their reaction first.
Dip a toe in the pool before jumping in.
Exactly. And that's what they suggest might be happening with UFOs.
Okay.
By gradually introducing the idea of extraterrestrial threats, they can see how people react, how far they can push the narrative without causing widespread panic.
So a slow drip of information, each revelation a little more dramatic than the last, testing the limits of what the public will accept. But is there any evidence that this kind of thing has actually happened before?
There are some unsettling historical parallels. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, where questionable reports of attacks were used to escalate the Vietnam War.
Right.
That's a chilling reminder of how information can be manipulated to achieve political goals.
And you're suggesting that something similar could be happening now with UFOs?
Mm-hmm.
That those in power might be using this phenomenon, whether it's real or not, to manipulate public perception and advance their own agendas.
It's a possibility we can't ignore. And the expert points to another even more disturbing example, Operation Northwoods.
Okay.
That was a declassified plan where U.S. officials considered staging fake attacks to justify military action against Cuba.
They were willing to potentially sacrifice American lives to create a pretext for war. That's horrifying.
It was never carried out, thankfully.
Yeah.
But it shows the lengths to which powerful entities might go to achieve their objectives through deception and manipulation.
So we've got 3 potential motivations here.
Yeah.
Distraction, fear as a unifying force, and testing the waters.
Right.
And we've got some pretty disturbing historical examples to show that this kind of thing isn't just the stuff of conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
It's happened before. But what about now?
Mm.
What might a potential UFO psyop actually look like in practice?
The expert lays out a hypothetical scenario that's, well, pretty unsettling.
Okay, I'm ready for it. Walk me through it.
Imagine it unfolds in stages.
Mm-hmm.
First, a normalization phase, where UFO sightings and discussions become increasingly commonplace. It's like what we're seeing now, lots of chatter, official acknowledgments, but still a sense of it's probably nothing to worry about.
So gradually make the idea of extraterrestrial life seem more plausible, but without causing widespread panic.
Then they suggest a big reveal event, something so dramatic and undeniable that it's impossible to ignore.
A giant mothership landing on the White House lawn.
Maybe not that dramatic, but they suggest a massive coordinated UFO sighting over major cities footage that defies explanation, or even a staged attack using advanced technology that's misattributed to aliens. They even mention using holographic technology to create convincing illusions.
Hold on. Holograms. Are we talking Tupac at Coachella level stuff here?
Think much more advanced. The point is, don't underestimate the potential for creating convincing illusions that could fool even the most skeptical observer.
Okay, so normalize, then create a spectacle. What's the final stage of this hypothetical psyop?
It's what they call the need for a savior. Once the threat feels real, governments step in as the heroes, offering solutions that might require sacrificing freedoms or increasing their control. Think. Expanded defense budgets, new surveillance measures, a global response team with sweeping powers.
So basically using this manufactured crisis to justify a power grab.
Mm-hmm.
And they're saying this hypothetical scenario has roots in actual historical events.
Absolutely. They bring up a plan that was actually considered,
Okay.
a plan to stage a fake alien invasion.
Wow.
The fact that it was even on the table is pretty chilling.
Okay, this is all getting a little freaky.
Yeah.
But even if we take it with a grain of salt, what can we as individuals actually do about it? We can't just sit here and wait for the holographic alien invasion.
That's where it gets really interesting. The expert provides a detailed guide to spotting psychological operations. Think of it as a masterclass in BS detection.
I'm all ears. Tell me how to level up my BS detector.
The first step is simple. Always analyze the source. Is it a credible outlet with a history of accuracy, or do they thrive on sensationalism? There's a big difference between, say, the New York Times and some random blog with a clickbait headline.
Makes sense. You can't treat all information as equal.
Exactly. And they also say to question the timing of a story.
Oh.
Does it appear during a major crisis, a scandal, an upcoming election? Remember those distraction tactics we talked about?
So be extra skeptical of any big attention-grabbing stories that pop up right when something else shady might be going down.
Got it. Another key tip is to pay attention to the language used in different reports.
Okay.
Are multiple outlets using the exact same phrases?
Right.
Psyops often rely on coordinated messaging. If phrases feel copy-pasted, that's a red flag.
Like those buzzwords we hear all the time. Unprecedented threat, undeniable evidence, those kinds of things.
Exactly. Those phrases are often designed to trigger an emotional response rather than encourage critical thinking. And that leads to their next point. Be aware of emotional triggers. Psyops are designed to push our buttons, using fear, anger, or even amazement to bypass rational thought.
Right.
If a story feels deliberately designed to make you react emotionally, step back and take a deep breath. Ask yourself why they're trying to make you feel that way.
Don't let them hijack your emotions. Easier said than done sometimes, but I get the point. What else should we be looking out for?
The most important thing is always to check the evidence.
Okay.
Are they providing concrete facts, data, or verifiable eyewitness accounts?
Yeah.
Or are they relying on anonymous sources, vague claims, or information that can't be independently corroborated?
Right, because extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
Exactly. And when it comes to potential government overreach, they suggest a simple question to ask yourself. Is this going to expand government control or justify new laws?
Okay.
If the answer is yes, be extra cautious about the information you're being fed.
That's a really good point, because often the justification for increased control is wrapped up in fear and the promise of safety.
And then they talk about analyzing how certain stories are covered.
Mm-hmm.
Psyops tend to dominate the news cycle, drowning out other important stories.
Yeah.
Real news, on the other hand, coexists with other events and reporting. So if one topic is suddenly everywhere while other major global events are being ignored, that's another red flag.
It's like they're trying to create a tunnel vision effect, focusing everyone's attention on this one manufactured narrative.
And finally, they offer a piece of advice that might sound a little touchy-feely,
Okay.
but they say to trust your gut. If something feels off or scripted, there's probably a reason for it. Your intuition can often pick up on subtle cues that your conscious mind might miss.
So it's okay to be a little discerning, a little skeptical.
Absolutely. Cultivate healthy skepticism and be willing to question even seemingly authoritative sources of information, because even the most trusted institutions can be compromised, and the truth is often more complex than any single narrative can capture. It all comes back to that idea of discernment. Don't blindly accept anything as truth, even if it comes from sources that seem credible.
It's like that old saying, trust but verify. Except in this case, the verification part is more important than ever. We're talking about potentially world-altering information here.
And that brings us to an interesting point. This whole deep dive hinges on the idea that governments are actually capable of orchestrating these elaborate deceptions. Don't governments tend to be well, kind of incompetent,
Right.
prone to leaks and blunders.
Yeah.
Wouldn't a psyop this big inevitably fall apart?
That was my first thought, too.
Yeah.
It all sounds a bit too, I don't know, Hollywood, doesn't it?
It's a valid question, and the expert acknowledges that governments can be bureaucratic and inefficient, but they also point out that when it comes to matters of national security and intelligence,
Yeah.
there are often highly specialized units that operate with a level of secrecy and efficiency that most people wouldn't believe.
So it's like those deep state conspiracy theories we hear about?
They don't necessarily use that term, but they do suggest that certain elements within governments possess the resources, technology, and motivation to carry out these kinds of operations. They argue the potential rewards in terms of increased power and control could be significant enough to justify the risks involved.
Okay, let's say for a moment that these shadowy units exist. Wouldn't they still need a lot of help to pull off something this massive? You can't just fake a global UFO event without involving a lot of people, right?
You're right. They acknowledge that any successful psyop of this scale would require the cooperation of other players, certain media outlets, scientists, even military personnel. They suggest coercion, bribery, and carefully crafted disinformation campaigns could be used to secure their cooperation.
It's like building a giant house of cards.
Yeah.
Each layer depends on the layers beneath it.
Yeah.
And the more layers you add, the more unstable it becomes.
Exactly. And that's why they keep emphasizing critical thinking and independent verification. The more people are willing to question the official narrative and dig for evidence, the harder it becomes to maintain these elaborate deceptions. It's like that story about the emperor's new clothes.
Right.
If enough people start pointing out the obvious, the illusion can't hold.
So even though they might have the resources and the motives, it's not a guaranteed success. There's always the possibility that someone will break ranks, that the truth will slip out.
That's why they highlight the role of the internet and social media. While these platforms can be used for spreading disinformation,
Right.
they can also be incredibly powerful tools for exposing it. The more people are sharing information and challenging each other's assumptions, the harder it becomes to control the narrative.
That's actually quite encouraging. It's like they're saying that even though the forces of manipulation might be powerful, the combined power of truth and critical thinking can ultimately prevail.
But they also caution against falling into the trap of believing every alternative theory that comes along. It's not about blindly rejecting one narrative and replacing it with another. It's about cultivating a healthy skepticism and questioning everything, even the information that confirms your existing biases.
So basically, don't just trade one set of blinders for another. Stay curious, stay critical, and don't be afraid to change your mind when the evidence warrants it.
Exactly. It's about cultivating intellectual humility, recognizing that we don't have all the answers, and being open to new information and perspectives.
Okay, we've explored the potential motivations behind a UFO psyop, the techniques that could be used, the idea that these operations might not be as foolproof as they seem, but there's one question that keeps nagging at me. Why now?
You're right. If governments have had the ability to manipulate public opinion about UFOs for decades, why are we seeing this apparent shift now? What's changed?
It feels like there's been a deliberate ramp-up in recent years. More official acknowledgments, more media coverage, more discussion about potential threats. It's like someone is turning up the volume little by little.
The expert doesn't offer a definitive answer to that question, but they do present a few interesting theories to consider. One possibility is that we've reached a technological tipping point where it's become increasingly difficult to maintain secrecy around UFOs.
With everyone having a smartphone, with the camera drones buzzing around and private companies launching satellites, there are simply more eyes on the sky than ever before.
Yeah.
It's harder to dismiss all those sightings as hoaxes or misidentifications.
Exactly. They argue that the cat might be out of the bag, so to speak.
Right.
And governments are now scrambling to regain control of the narrative.
So they're trying to get ahead of the story before it gets ahead of them.
Another theory they suggest is that there might be a genuine increase in UFO activity.
So it's not just about governments controlling the narrative. It's possible that something is actually happening out there that's attracting more attention. But why now?
That's the mystery. Maybe there's a shift occurring on a cosmic scale that's bringing more extraterrestrial attention to our planet.
Or maybe, as they jokingly suggest, our planet's collective consciousness has reached a certain level of awareness that's making us more visible to other beings.
And then there's a theory that connects this whole UFO phenomenon to the broader political and social upheavals that are happening in the world right now. The rising tensions between global superpowers, the climate crisis, economic instability. It's a lot to process.
It feels like the world is becoming increasingly volatile and unpredictable. Could those in power be using the UFO issue as a way to distract us from these other problems, to create a sense of unity against a perceived external threat?
It's a cynical view, but one that's worth considering. They argue that the more chaotic and uncertain the world becomes, the more tempting it will be for those in power to use fear and manipulation to maintain control.
It's like the classic tactic of creating an enemy to unite the people. Forget about your problems, folks. There are aliens out there we need to worry about.
And they argue that it's up to each of us to be aware of these tactics, to question the narratives we're being told, and to resist the temptation to surrender our critical thinking skills to those who claim to have all the answers.
It's about recognizing that the world is complex, that there are multiple perspectives on every issue, and that those in power often have their own agendas.
And those agendas might not always align with the best interests of the people they claim to represent.
So even though the why now question doesn't have a clear answer, it opens up a whole new layer of complexity to this whole UFO discussion. It's not just about whether UFOs are real or not. It's about understanding the context in which this information is being presented and the potential motivations of those who are controlling the narrative.
And it's about recognizing that we as individuals have a responsibility to be critical thinkers, to question everything, and to demand evidence before accepting any claim as truth.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. We've explored potential motivations behind a UFO psyop, the techniques they might use, and how this phenomenon might be connected to larger global events. But there's one thing I still feel like we're missing.
What's that?
The human element. We've been talking about governments and shadowy organizations and media outlets, but what about the people who are actually experiencing these UFO sightings? The pilots, the military personnel, everyday citizens who see things in the sky that they can't explain. Are we just dismissing all these accounts as unreliable or fabrications?
That's an important point, and the expert addresses this in their analysis. They acknowledge that there are countless credible reports from people who have witnessed things that seem to defy conventional explanations, and they don't dismiss these accounts. They take them seriously.
So they're not just throwing all these eyewitnesses under the bus, so to speak.
Not at all. They suggest that there might be multiple phenomena at play here. Some sightings might be misidentifications, some might be hoaxes, but some might be genuinely unexplained events that challenge our current understanding of the world.
It's possible that there are real UFOs out there, and the information about them might be being manipulated and exploited for other purposes. So it's not a black and white issue. It's much more nuanced than that.
Exactly. And they argue that it's important to be open to the possibility of the unknown, but also to be discerning and critical in our evaluation of the information we're being given.
It's about finding that sweet spot between curiosity and skepticism, being open to the possibility that there's more to the universe than we currently understand, but also being wary of those who might exploit that curiosity for their own gain.
And that brings us to another crucial point. What if, even after applying all these critical thinking skills, we still can't figure out what's real and what's not? What if the truth is so deeply buried beneath layers of deception and disinformation that it's impossible to uncover?
That's a question that has kept philosophers and truth seekers up at night for centuries. How can we know anything for certain when there's always the possibility of being deceived?
The expert doesn't claim to have a definitive answer, but they offer a thought-provoking perspective on how we might approach this challenge. They suggest that perhaps the most important thing isn't necessarily finding the absolute truth, but rather cultivating the ability to live with uncertainty.
Live with uncertainty. That seems counterintuitive, doesn't it? We're constantly bombarded with information, with people claiming to have the answers to everything.
But in a world where information is constantly being manipulated and reframed, the ability to tolerate ambiguity and to hold multiple possibilities in mind without clinging to anyone with absolute certainty might be our greatest asset.
So it's about being comfortable with the gray areas, not needing to force everything into neat categories of right or wrong, true or false.
Exactly.
All right.
They suggest that this kind of intellectual humility, this willingness to acknowledge the limits of our own knowledge and understanding, might actually make us more resilient to manipulation. Because if we're not desperately clinging to any one belief system, we're less likely to be swayed by those who offer easy answers and simplistic solutions.
It's almost a paradox, isn't it? The less certain we are, the more difficult it becomes for others to manipulate us.
It's about recognizing that the search for truth is an ongoing process and that we'll never have all the answers. But the process of inquiry itself is valuable. It helps us hone our critical thinking skills, expand our perspectives, and develop a more nuanced understanding of the world around us.
So it's not just about reaching the destination. It's about enjoying the journey and
Mhm.
being open to the possibility that the path might twist and turn along the way. But there's still a part of me that wants a resolution to this whole UFO mystery. I want to know what's really going on.
And the expert doesn't rule out the possibility of future revelations. They suggest that as technology advances and more people come forward with their own experiences, we might eventually get a clearer picture of what's really happening.
So there's still hope for a big reveal.
Maybe. But they leave us with one final thought to ponder, regardless of whether UFOs are real or not, or if we ever get definitive answers.
Okay, lay it on me.
They urge us to be vigilant, to be discerning, and to never surrender our critical thinking skills to anyone, not even those who claim to be acting in our best interest.
To always question, to always seek evidence, and to never stop searching for the truth, even if it's elusive.
Exactly. And that's a message that applies to far more than just UFOs. It's a message for how we navigate a world that's increasingly saturated with information, disinformation, and competing narratives.
It's about taking ownership of our beliefs and not letting ourselves become pawns in someone else's game.
And that's the key takeaway here. This deep dive isn't about convincing you to believe or disbelieve anything specific about UFOs.
Right.
It's about giving you the tools to analyze the information for yourself and come to your own conclusions.
We've explored the potential for a UFO psyop, the techniques that might be involved, and the historical precedents that make this possibility more than just a far-fetched conspiracy theory. We've also talked about the importance of critical thinking, questioning everything, and even being comfortable with uncertainty.
And we've acknowledged the very real possibility that some UFO sightings might be genuinely unexplained events, even if the information surrounding them is being manipulated.
So after all this, where do we stand? Are we any closer to answering the question of whether we're being deliberately misled about UFOs?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And unfortunately, there's no easy answer.
Yeah.
But what we do have is a more nuanced understanding of the complexities involved. We've learned about the potential motivations, the tactics, and the historical patterns that make this whole situation so difficult to decipher.
And we've also been reminded that the search for truth is rarely a straightforward process. It's messy, it's complicated, and it often leaves us with more questions than answers.
But that doesn't mean we should give up on the search. On the contrary, I think this deep dive has shown us how important it is to stay engaged, to stay informed, and to never stop questioning the information we're being given.
So what's the final takeaway for our listeners? What can they do with all this information?
I would say the most important thing is to keep that critical thinking muscle flexed. Don't just passively consume information. Go out there and actively seek it out, question everything, and consider different perspectives.
Because even if we don't have all the answers right now, the very act of asking questions, of challenging assumptions, and engaging in thoughtful dialogue is a step in the right direction.
And who knows, maybe through our collective effort to seek truth and hold those in power accountable, we'll eventually get a clearer picture of what's really going on, not just with UFOs, but with all the complex issues facing our world.
I like that, a call to action. It's not just about being aware of the potential for manipulation. It's about empowering ourselves to become active participants in the search for truth.
Exactly. And on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive.
But before we go, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought. Remember, the truth is out there somewhere, but it's up to each of us to keep searching for it, to keep questioning, and to never stop wondering.
And maybe, just maybe, if we keep our minds open and our BS detectors tuned to high, we'll eventually find out if we're truly alone in the universe or not.
That's a question for another deep dive. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Until next time, keep those minds sharp and stay curious.